How did I actually get to researching hormones and brain development and end up with this as a research focus? I didn't have friends. I was shy. I was homeschooled for 2 years in high school, but that was only after being bullied a lot. Even something like eye contact, the way I'm looking at you now, I used to be really afraid of that. I really only socialized and found joy on online video games. Online video games, it's mostly males.
Oh my boy!
The few girls that you'll see there, they get tons of attention. I learned at a pretty early age, I can do that. I'd even catfish and pretend to be someone's girlfriend. Your dad's Bible series resonated a lot with me. He really talks about the depths of those negative experiences. So the fundamental question for transgender identity is it more similar to sexual orientation, born this way, or is it more similar to anorexia, social contagion? I think the answer is both for different people. That's the oversimplification. The nuance here is that
Adam Omary, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you, Mikhaila.
Yeah,
blessed to be here.
Great. Well, I'm really excited for this. This is going to be interesting. But I think we should jump right in. We went out for dinner last night. We were talking about the famous twin study. So can you describe what that is?
Dr. John Money was a famous psychologist and sexologist. He was one of the first people to really promote sex change surgery for transgender people, and particularly for transgender kids. So this was happening in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. And it was coming off of this blank slatist, social constructivist view to gender. So we didn't know as much about genetics or how sex hormones influence brain development during critical windows prenatally are the first early signs of sex differentiation. So the theory was, in absence of all that, and knowing how powerful behaviorism was, how powerful social learning is, that all of these gender stereotypes that we see, and given that so many of them are culturally specific, we don't know if you were to raise a child of one sex completely as the opposite sex, everyone was on board, and even their body, like if you did a sex reassignment surgery, if this genetic male child had a vagina and was raised as a girl all his or her life, then would they identify as a healthy, functional woman? And it was an open question, but there was enough of a theory to think that that's very well what will happen. So there have been various cases, but the ideal would be a twin study, like people with the exact same genetics, exact same environment, and you take one and raise them the opposite sex, but everyone knew it would be unethical. So it was pretty much a fluke that this perfect natural experiment came along. A set of twin boys born in Canada, they had a circumcision, and one of the circumcisions was botched, and the boy's penis was destroyed. And because of this, they were referred to all sorts of medical specialists, including John Money. And the theory was, this was also based on Freudian psychoanalytic influence. You're thinking about sexual development being critical for healthy psychological development. So this thought of this boy growing up without a penis, he's going to be very insecure in his manhood. He's never going to have a functional sexual life. How's he going to get married? He's going to be depressed. He'd be way better off living as a woman. We can construct a functional vagina. At the time, vaginoplasties had been developed, but it's much harder to construct an artificial penis, especially in a child. So the thought was, here's this perfect natural experiment. So, part of it, I think, was this authentic desire to promote what they thought would be in the child's best interest. But the other part of it that certainly was in the back of John Money's mind is, this is the perfect experiment to test my theory.
Yeah, that's horrifying.
So this child was raised as a girl, Brenda, and her brother, Brian, was a typical healthy boy. And Brenda was very tomboyish, and at early ages, like before 8 or so, experienced what we would now call gender dysphoria, but didn't really know how to say it other than, I don't feel like other girls, but not just tomboyish.
Was the kid told what had happened, or did
Eventually,
But not at that time? Okay.
Not till he was 14.
Wow.
So he was tomboyish, but not just that, because he was told, well, lots of girls are kind of more rough and tumble. They're into boys' things. But he felt, no, it's not just that. Like, I don't feel like I'm in the right body. And again, without really having the language for that. And he's told this to his doctors, but John Money turned out to be quite biased. So in all of the papers that were published at the time, in that first decade or two, you hear nothing but a success story of, look, there's twins. He was born a male. Now he's living as a healthy girl. So feminine, you wouldn't believe it. Wears dresses, says he's a girl, everything like that.
Wow.
But experiencing gender dysphoria and depression and anxiety symptoms the entire time. And then once the puberty age comes along, well, he's not a girl, so he's not going to naturally go through puberty. So there's this critical juncture where you have to start taking estrogen. And they did give him estrogen for a brief time and started growing breasts. And then combined with the depression that she was already experiencing. And you see the pronouns are confusing. I'm already going a bit back and forth between he and she. So this case isn't working. And so she gains a lot of weight in order to hide her breasts because she hates this female figure that the estrogen is developing and just starts to become suicidal. So finally, after all that and the trauma that it causes in this family, the parents tell him what happened. And he said suddenly it all clicked, that I was born a boy. This is why I'm so much like my brother. It's not just that we're opposite sex twins and we share some interests. Like literally, we share all of our genes. I was meant to be a boy. And then you might think, okay, so gender identity is genetically ingrained. And actually, I should finish telling you about this story. So it's not a happy ending.
Oh, no.
So Brenda, after 14 or so, decides to live as a boy, stops taking the estrogen, starts taking testosterone, even gets surgery to construct a penis later, and renames himself David Reimer, and continues living as a man for another 2 decades or so, even gets married and has kids, but tragically ends in suicide. He struggled with depression his whole life. John Money, the sexologist, while doing these yearly check-ins that he would do with the twins, he'd show them porn, he'd ask them to strip down and do all sorts of weird tests. He was in this mindset that America is so Puritan and that we're so repressive in our attitude towards sex and we just need to liberate it. So for example, he thought that homosexuality, which at the time was still in the DSM as a mental disorder, he thought that it was a matter of children not being exposed to healthy sexual role models. So he also encouraged David and Brian's parents to walk around nude and have sex in front of the children. They didn't do that. They drew the line there. But his theory, and when Brenda entered puberty, so she's still a girl before she knew what happened, she thought she was gay. She was attracted to other girls. So that's interesting. Genetically, is there something that sexuality encodes, whether it's you're homosexual or straight? It's completely dissociable from gender identity. So the twin study showed that as well. And John Money, he was willing to admit that part, show that in some cases she's more tomboyish, maybe she's gay, but still she's what we would now call cisgender. It was a success in that regard. But he was so adamant that it must have been because the parents had this unhealthy attitude towards sex. The parents' marriage really was falling apart ever since this botched circumcision ruined their family. So John Money's theory was Brenda's gay not because she was born a boy, but because she witnessed this unhealthy marital dynamic.
Oh yeah, of course. Blame the parents rather than thinking maybe he could be wrong.
Blame the parents.
Yeah.
Right. So this makes us think, okay, now with modern knowledge of genetics, gender identity, and maybe sexual orientation, it must be genetic. And then in grad school, I learned about this intersex condition, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So the most extreme case of this, with complete androgen insensitivity, That means that you can produce androgens like testosterone, but the androgen receptor doesn't work, so it's functionally inert. So you can have a genetic male with a Y chromosome, and I didn't learn this until grad school either. The Y chromosome, what it really does, the SRY gene on the Y chromosome produces testes determining factor, which is a protein that's used to construct the testes out of undifferentiated gonadal cells. So in the first 6 weeks of fetal development, the gonads are sexually undifferentiated. And I initially assumed that it was the Y chromosome that coded for development of the penis and other secondary sex characteristics. No, that's not true. It's all downstream effects of testosterone. The only thing the Y chromosome does is it determines whether you develop testes or, in absence of a Y chromosome, ovaries during that early period of fetal development.
That's interesting.
Okay, so in a genetic male with complete androgen insensitivity, first 6 weeks of fetal development look normal, and then they do produce testes, and the testes do produce testosterone, but the androgen receptor doesn't work. So it doesn't bind to anything. So functionally, it's inert. And free-floating testosterone in males can interact with an enzyme called aromatase. So it's aromatized into estrogen. And those low levels of estrogen that are typical in males are enough for the development of female characteristics. It's normally inhibited by testosterone, but in absence of any testosterone, even if you have a Y chromosome, the baby will develop a vagina and be assigned female at birth. So that's interesting too, because people criticize the binary sex idea and say it's a social construct, it's assigned at birth, it's an arbitrary physician rating. Obviously it's not arbitrary. In 99.9% of cases, there's complete overlap between genetic sex, phenotypic sex based on external genitalia, hormonal sex, but in some of these intersex disorders, they are dissociable. So you can have a genetic male, identified female at birth, and then raised as a girl. So this is, in a way, a more perfect case than the twin study, because in the twin study, everyone knew that at least for the first couple weeks or months up to the circumcision, this was a boy. And even the social constructivists could counter, well, Brenda wasn't really raised as a girl because everyone knew in the back of their mind that she's secretly a boy. So maybe she's tomboyish because they were treating her different in these unconscious ways.
Yeah.
But with CAIS, they're genetically male, they're raised as female, they don't even know anything's wrong with them because, again, perfectly healthy female genitalia. So then you might think they're going to live their lives as prepubescent girls because they don't have any testosterone, they're not going to go through male puberty, but they don't have ovaries. How are they going to go through female puberty? But it turns out that low level of estrogen and progesterone that males have is enough for the development of female secondary sex characteristics.
Wow.
It just normally is inhibited by testosterone. So then these girls will start growing breasts, fat will redistribute around the hips, other female secondary sex characteristics, but they won't ever get their period because they don't have ovaries.
Wow.
So a girl with CAIS, even though they're genetically male, here I'm using the term girl, and I think that would be appropriate. They're going to identify as girls. They're even overwhelmingly attracted to men, exclusively heterosexual, and identify as women, but they are essentially infertile women, and they don't find out until they're 15, 16, have never gotten a period. They go to the doctor to see what's wrong, and they find out that they don't have ovaries, they have testes inside their abdomen that never descended.
That's crazy. What percentage of the population does this hit?
Complete androgen insensitivity, definitely less than 1 in 10,000.
Yeah, okay. That's still quite a few. That would be shocking. If you guys want to purchase this magical supplement, see how it shines, and reduce your poisoning by alcohol, we're available on Amazon now. And if you type in after party and scroll around or go to fullerhealth.com or check the link in the description or pinned comment, it's there. Look at this packaging. It glistens. How extra is this? Can I do this without ripping? I can indeed. Here it is, After Party. There we go. It's available on Amazon, and I will link it below, but please reduce your damage from alcohol if you drink, because it's silly not to. There's a money-back guarantee. It really works. I hope you're enjoying this episode.
Right. So what that tells us, it's not genetics alone. It's prenatal hormones during a specific critical window of brain development that seems to determine gender identity and sexual orientation. And there's a couple other intersex disorders that we can use to hone in on that hypothesis further. All right. So another one is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is one that I've published original research on. So congenital means present from birth. Adrenal hyperplasia means overactive adrenal glands. So what happens due to a genetic disorder that results in deficiency in an enzyme called 21-hydroxylase, which is an enzyme necessary to synthesize cortisol, the adrenals go into overdrive, attempting to produce more cortisol. And cortisol, everyone knows, is a stress hormone, but it's also necessary in low levels just for basic functioning like metabolism. So adrenals go into overdrive. They begin producing other precursor androgens that can be synthesized into cortisol typically, but can also be synthesized into testosterone. And since their cortisol system doesn't work properly, they have excess levels of testosterone. And CAH can affect both males and females. But if it happens to a male, well, they'll have more testosterone, but it's within the male typical range of variability, which is very large. And it can be deadly if left untreated, but typically it's diagnosed shortly after birth and they're given glucocorticoid supplementation. So the real effects happen in females because then they have male typical levels of prenatal testosterone during this critical window for brain development. So there's been decades of studies of girls with CAH, and they turn out overwhelmingly to be more tomboyish, more interested in rough and tumble play, exhibit boy play preferences, and during adulthood, 30 to 40% of them, compared to about 1 to 2% in the general population, identify as gay or bisexual.
Wow.
So those two pieces put together, CAIS and CAH, to me are very strong evidence that it's prenatal sex hormones, and particularly androgen exposure, that determine whether in absence of androgens, you're going to develop a female phenotype and be attracted to men. And in presence of androgens, you're at the very least more likely to be attracted to women. Like the girls with CAH, they're not overwhelmingly gay. In fact, a majority of them aren't, but way more likely to be. And then similarly, for males, most males are attracted to women, and yet genetic males without any testosterone are overwhelmingly attracted to men. That's interesting.
Wow, that is interesting. Okay, so you know a lot about this.
There's one more intersex disorder.
Go. Keep going. No, keep going.
Okay. I should also add, CAH is the most common, and it affects about 1 out of every 10,000 births. So I think that the other ones being more rare than that, add them all up, and you're probably looking at less than 1 in 1,000 for all of these severe intersex conditions. I should also add the term intersex, some people now say is outdated or offensive. The technical term that people like is differences in sexual development, or DSDs. I think intersex is more straightforward, and we're talking to a general audience here, so that's an important distinction to make. But 5-alpha reductase deficiency. So earlier I said it's all testosterone that determines whether you grow a penis, and it's testosterone that acts on the brain to produce these psychological sex differences. That's the oversimplification. The nuance here is that testosterone interacts with an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase, and it's converted into dihydrotestosterone, DHT. And DHT is what actually constructs the penis. So with 5-alpha reductase deficiency, this is another really interesting natural experiment where you can have a genetic male with typical levels of testosterone and functioning androgen receptors. So testosterone organizes the brain in the male typical way, but they don't have any DHT, so they're not going to be born with a penis. And again, in absence of that, female typical development is the blank slate default condition. So they'll be born with a vagina, they'll be identified female at birth, they'll probably be more tomboyish like CAH, although I don't know of any evidence on that. This condition is much rarer. And then at puberty, this is where it really gets different because they still have testes, and the testes still produce testosterone. They have a vagina, but the testosterone is what produces other secondary sex characteristics. So then you have this girl who's maybe more tomboyish, maybe not, but has lived her life identifying as a girl. And then suddenly she hits puberty and starts growing a beard, starts deepening her voice, other male characteristics. And this one is really interesting because the other conditions I told you about, the gender dysphoria tends to manifest, well, with CAIS, there's not even any dysphoria. They're just completely woman. They find out they're infertile, but other than that, they're healthy. With CAH, they're more likely to experience gender dysphoria, and that's pretty much a function of how much prenatal androgens they're exposed to, because in the most severe form, the testosterone will even masculinize their genitalia. So it'll be full-on intersex, ambiguous genitalia. The clitoris will grow into what looks like a micropenis. The labia will grow outwards, and if it's severe enough, even fuse into a scrotum, but not fully functional. You'll also see this with partial androgen insensitivity. So the complete condition is the most straightforward. It's also the rarest. But if you have partial androgen insensitivity with lower than average testosterone, it could go anywhere from having, say, a clinically underdeveloped micropenis to ambiguous genitalia if you have, say, not enough to grow a functional penis, but also way more than female typical. So when people say sex is a spectrum, sex itself is binary, but just the forms that your genitals can take during early development do take on this spectrum that's dependent on how much prenatal testosterone, or particularly DHT, you're exposed to. Okay, so back to 5-alpha reductase. Without any DHT and with testosterone and with secondary male sex characteristics at puberty, it's about a 50-50 shot. Some of them experience gender dysphoria and want to go on androgen blockers and continue to living their lives as women. They take estrogen to grow the female characteristics that their body can't naturally produce and go on to live healthy lives as unfertile women. And others decide to fully let the testosterone take its course, and maybe they can get a phalloplasty to continue to live their lives as men.
That's crazy. And you said that, so all of that is 1 in 1,000 people, you think?
I would say 1 in 1,000 would be the umbrella stat for any one of these different disorders. And even that is a massive overestimate because CAH, for example, even though it's classified as an intersex condition, well, for one thing, in half of them, it happens in males. So you're going to experience the same medical issues with cortisol deficiency, but no real issues of sex development. And then even of the females who have CAH, it's only ambiguous genitalia and gender dysphoria in the most extreme cases. Maybe they'll turn out to be gay, but they can still live perfectly healthy lives as women, and they are genetically women, so.
That's wild. Okay, so a few questions. One, why do you know so much about this? Like, what was it
It's
about?
my whole PhD.
Yeah, but what made you decide to study this? Was it like rampant talk about gender dysphoria that you grew up around, or like why did this interest you specifically? It's fascinating. Like, you do a lecture on Peterson Academy, probably. That sounded like a science class. That was really good. Yeah, that was really good. But what made you decide to become interested in this?
Thank you, Mikhaila. Well, there's two separate answers. There's the practical, how did I actually get to researching hormones and brain development and end up with this as a research focus? And then there's, like you said, what makes me interested in it, because it sounds so niche, right? So this actually connects to, I think, some of the personal interests that we're going to get into, like about my upbringing being homeschooled and growing up with a single mom and spending a lot of time online and having to learn social dynamics in a somewhat unorthodox way. But I'll start with the research. That's more straightforward. So I came into college actually to study physics, but pretty quickly I switched into cognitive science. At first, stemming from the physics background, I was interested in artificial intelligence and thinking I was going to do something very computer programmy. I was good at math. But I realized pretty early on in these classes that we know way less about human intelligence. How are we going to build artificial intelligence? I mean, we have succeeded in a way, but we also can't really debate on, what is a woman? So to me, as you mentioned, some of this political stuff going on in the background, it made me think there were more foundational philosophical questions to be addressed through neuroscience. And then my first neuroscience lab, really just by happenstance, happened to be focusing on hormones and brain development. And I got to work with CAH populations. So this was pre-collected data, and we were looking at structural brain differences between children with and without CAH. So the other thing that's interesting about this natural experiment design, you can test two things simultaneously about the hormones. So if you see an effect that's present in both males and females with CAH, but not in typically developing children, then it's probably a result of either the cortisol deficiency prenatally or more likely the glucocorticoid supplementation. Because if you're taking chronic low levels of cortisol, it's almost like chronic stress exposure, which we know impacts the brain, hippocampal volume in particular, which is the biggest effect that we found. But if you see an effect that's only present in CAH females relative to control females, then it's probably the prenatal androgen exposure. And you do see both of those. You see some effects that are probably glucocorticoid driven, present in both sexes, and then you see some effects, including the behavioral and psychological ones, that are only present in females.
Interesting. Okay, before we get into your background, what does cortisol, what do hyper-stressful situations like long-term do to the brain?
Oh, this isn't my area of expertise. Robert Sapolsky has a great book on this called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the basic idea, I guess there's two. The first is very low levels of cortisol. It has other physiological functions that are just necessary for survival. But I'm not a physician. I couldn't list those out. But then in terms of psychological stress response, this fight or flight response, we know that cortisol, a spike in the short term, is really adaptive. So why don't zebras get ulcers? Well, they'll experience a massive cortisol spike when they're running away from a lion. And then, they chill out. Only humans, actually primates, Sapolsky's done great work on this, will experience chronic stress, even from social bullying, like anything, even if all of your physiological needs are met. We have social needs too, as social mammals.
And what does chronic stress do? Can you reverse it? I know this isn't your area of expertise, but does it shrink your brain?
It can shrink your hippocampus, which is necessary for forming memories.
Oh my gosh.
It can impair memory, especially if this happens during early development. So there's this idea of sensitive or critical windows for brain development. A critical is like fully use it or lose it. And you'll see, so a lot of these early studies, they sound very mad scientist-y, and they kind of are. So for whatever reason, a lot of the early studies on visual development were done on kittens. And, when you say we're done in terms of a neuroscience experiment, often it ends with the animal being euthanized because you have to dissect its brain. So rodents are most commonly used for these invasive neuroscience studies, but cats, maybe because they were larger, maybe because they have a longer window of plasticity. So plasticity is the term for how malleable your brain is and during specific windows. So you'll see that there's sort of this parallel between evolution and ontogeny, development within a particular lifespan. So the idea is the earlier a function is, like sensory motor brain regions mature the earliest, like within the first few months. So these scientists, what they would do, they would blindfold kittens for the first few months of their life. And if they did that and they had no light exposure, then they would be permanently blind into adulthood. But if you took a kitten who was exposed to normal light and developed normal vision for the first few months, and then you blindfold them after the visual cortex matures, and then you blindfold them for years, they'll still be able to see when you take it off.
Wow.
So that's the strongest example I know of for critical period. And then psychologists have taken this for language. There's also a pretty strong critical period for language development in the first 5 or so years of life. And then in adolescence, in my main area of study, there's argument that it's a critical period for higher order cognitive development. So this is things like planning about the future, evaluating risks, social cognition, emotion regulation, high level stuff like that. But then there's also this term critical versus sensitive. So with vision in the first few months, if you don't have light exposure, no amount of light exposure later on will help. For sensitive period, it's more like it's a period of heightened plasticity, but it's not all or nothing.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay, you might not know anything about this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So if you put people on something like, and this pertains to me because I was on medication throughout my developmental years. I've always wondered what that did to my brain. And I'm not saying you know that because I don't know if anybody knows that. But if you put somebody, what's your guess here? If you put a kid on something like an SSRI, because like my experience was it dampened down. I took risks when I shouldn't have taken risks. And that's part of my personality, but I don't know how much that was influenced by the medication. Do you have any thoughts here?
If you become more of a risk-prone personality type or even more disagreeable,
the stress
but it's because of early serotonin levels, I don't know.
I wonder, okay, because I know I would put myself into risky situations without being scared, and I'm sure that was blunted from the SSRIs. So I've always just wondered throughout my developmental years if that made me less risk averse than I should have been. Not that I'm unhappy about it or anything, but it was like maybe.
So there is a tie-in there about other forms of medication that we give to kids. So puberty blockers is the one on the forefront of my mind, and that's been an active area of research for me recently. Not working with primary data, but just reading animal studies, giving them puberty blockers and looking at effects of brain development and whether or not it's generalizable to humans, looking at the limited number of human studies that have been published. But there is a meaningful connection there to SSRIs, which is that a lot of people criticize the animal models of puberty blockers or hormone replacement. They'll say it's not generalizable to transgender people or even just to humans because, well, it's an animal model. But most research, most things we know about the brain stems from animal research. And a lot of these things, especially subcortical structures, the more basic, the earlier evolved the brain region is, the more likely it is to be conserved across mammals. And mammalian brains are more similar than they are different. They operate on the same neurotransmitters, the same hormones, same sensitive periods during phases of life. And you'll have these behavioral markers that you'll use to test whether a drug works or not. So something like antidepressants, you're not just going to test it on a human right away. You want to have a rodent model for it first, but how are you going to measure whether a rodent is depressed or whether it's actually alleviating depression? And I don't know the specifics, but the basic idea is they have a whole array of standardized paradigms looking at things like appetite or play behavior or sex behavior. And researchers have coded how a typical animal responds and how a depressed-like animal responds or an anxious-like animal responds. And generally, you'll validate whether an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety med works by looking at the behavior. So the interesting thing is, in these puberty blocker studies, there's some preliminary evidence in rodents and in sheep that they may increase anxiety or depressive-like symptoms. Now, we don't know if that generalizes to humans, but based on the psychopharmacology of how antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds work, and just on this general theory that sex hormones are critical for brain development during puberty, I'm sure that there's some effect. And in fact, we do know there's some effect. We just really don't know what it's going to be. Like if you find a structural brain difference, with some, it's really straightforward. Your hippocampus is shrinking, you're going to have impaired memory. But for a lot of these, especially for cortical networks, where there's enough plasticity that there can be trade-offs. So like one area shrinks, another area grows to take its place. Like in the extreme examples of this, you'll see that if a child loses one sensory system at an early enough age, other sensory systems will grow and improve to make up for it. That's neuroplasticity in action.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's what happens when somebody goes blind really little, right? Does
Right.
their hearing actually improve?
I don't know if the hearing itself improves. I would think yes, but at the very least, we do know, well, depending on the type of brain damage, if it's literally brain damage, like the area is lesioned and there's tissue that just simply isn't there anymore, then yeah, auditory cortex will grow to fill in what used to be visual cortex. And presumably that comes with improved function.
Oh, wow. That's cool. If you guys are not filtering your air, it is the easiest thing. It's the laziest thing you can do to improve your health. I'm so gung-ho about this. I literally travel with an air purifier for hotel rooms. Seriously. I've been talking about air purifiers for years, but I didn't realize how important they are until I stopped being able to think because of a very moldy house. Air Oasis is top of the line. The type of air filter you buy really matters, and Air Oasis filters down to the right particle size, which is why I'm suggesting them. Air Oasis has a new iAdapt Air model. That's what I'd get. They have a medical grade H13 HEPA filter that filters down to 0.003 microns, which means they trap particles 10 times smaller than most other brands. They have germicidal UV technology to sterilize the air purifier itself and the environment. They also use a silver ion filter that penetrates the cell membrane of mold, bacteria, and viruses and reduces pathogens by up to 99%. I own a number of them. There's one in every room. They're also quiet. They come with free shipping, a lifetime warranty, and a 60-day money-back guarantee. You can get 10% off your purchase by using code MP at checkout by going to airoasis.com/products/iAdaptAir-large or select the size you want with code MP for 10% off. That is linked in the description and in the pinned comment. Enjoy the rest of this episode. Okay, let's get into your background a little bit, because from what you told me yesterday and from what I know about you, it's interesting. And I think my audience will find it interesting. But you grew up in LA, you had a single mom. What was your childhood like?
I played a lot of video games, and my mom is part-time piano teacher, music director at her church. We also wanted to talk about spirituality, so that may tie in here. But basically, I didn't have a strong male role model in my life. I didn't have friends. I was shy. I was homeschooled for 2 years in high school, but that was only after being bullied a lot. And I was bullied for my weight. I gained a lot of weight. I was 250 pounds when I was 15 years old and didn't have any friends, didn't have any romantic interest. I really only socialized and found joy on online video games. And it's such a different world. And I think this is, in a way, where the early obsession with sex differences comes in, because online video games, it's mostly males. And the few girls that you'll see there, they get tons of attention. Often it looks like harassment. But on these video games, and as a naive kid, I was thinking, there's this term on my favorite game, RuneScape, buying GF, buying girlfriend. So people would literally say that. And, sometimes you'd have someone trade them. Like they'd have this female character following them around like Entourage. They'd give them money or free stuff. So I learned at a pretty early age, I can do that. I can play as a female character. I'd even catfish and pretend to be someone's girlfriend. This might have been as early as 10 years old. I don't think I even knew what it meant, other than, hey, this person's gonna give me free stuff. So I'd walk around as a female character. I'd also go on these online chat rooms like Omegle or Kick Friends. And this was really if I was lonely and trying to chat with people. So often what I'd find is, I'll make a bio about myself. I'll post about my interests. I'll say I'm 15 years old. I want to chat. I'd get no messages. And then I make the exact same bio. I say I'm a girl. I get dozens of messages. And a lot of them are probably other lonely boys like me. And we have common interests in video games. They're like, it's so cool that you're into video games and you're a chick. You're like the perfect bro. We'd bond. But they'd fall in love with me. Often a friendship like that would end because they're like, oh my gosh, you're the perfect girl. It's just it's like you're a guy, but you're not. And often I'd find that I could get more attention if I just put a pretty picture. So I'd find random girls on the internet and just post a random photo and pretend to be that person. That never backfired, hopefully. So, so I'd also get lots of dick pics. And for the most part, I just block them.
The unfortunate part of it all.
Right. But, this was in the early Wild West of the internet, at least for teenagers. So this is back when you go in Xbox Live chat rooms and everyone is cursing up a storm and you're sending like the weirdest porn you can find, or ISIS beheading videos. Like all of my video game friends were really fucked up, and so was I. So I think part of that had to do with whatever almost unconscious resentment for not having friends or being popular in the real world. So it's like, part of it stemmed into this early version of perfectionism. How can I get the highest level, get the best gear, form a clan and get into a high rank? Like social status within this virtual world. Eventually in my late teens, it snapped. Like I could just grind in real life, grind as if it's a video game, work on my fitness, obsessively calorie count. I did all that and succeeded after basically treating it like a video game.
Yeah. That was wise. I think people have to realize that. My dad has talked a lot about, people who, this is mostly people who take drugs or something like that, is you have to turn your life into the gamble, kind of make it into the game. You have to have like enough going on. So you ended up, I want to get into that. You ended up losing a bunch of weight young, which was very disciplined. That's very difficult for people to do, especially the way you did it. Because you calorie counted.
I didn't do it smart though. I calorie counted obsessively, but I would eat the unhealthy food if it was lower calories. I didn't have really any knowledge of whole foods or like what's healthy.
Yeah, still. That's impressive though. How old were you?
I was 16 when I started. I lost 80 pounds in 14 months. So I said I used to be 70 pounds heavier. I got really skinny first. I went all the way down to 165. And by then, I was still shy and awkward, but I did have this fantasy of, okay, I don't want to just graduate the weird homeschooled kid and never experience graduation or prom or anything like that. So I wanted to get back into school. So senior year, I re-enrolled into public school. I still didn't make friends. I was still really shy, but I slowly started coming out of my shell more. And that's when I was 165 pounds. And then senior year, I started working out for the first time. So by college, I was back up to like 180 pounds and had some muscle, less than I have now. But like I looked normal. And I only later learned, I graduated high school still without my first kiss. But I later learned, some girls actually had a crush on me. Then they just spoke to me and I was so awkward that they lost it. But at the beginning, it was like, hey, this is a new kid coming in. He's not that bad looking. He seems to be smart. And then he's practically autistic. So you lose the interest there. And then I get to college and dating apps are a big thing. So I get on Tinder and it was still the same thing. Like I started getting a good amount of matches. I still had all my friends, the ones that lasted, were these online friends that I'd never met in person from video games. A lot of them were still overweight and awkward and still never had any success with girls. So just the fact that I was now reasonably fit and going to USC, which has a very attractive student body and is a pretty social school. It also has a great research department and it's connected with Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. So I kind of just steered into the research direction after I failed to succeed at, the extroverted party life. But online apps were different because, at first you begin texting and I was familiar with that, right? Not only that, but in some ways, I think I got more in touch with my anima, we can use the Jungian term, like my feminine characteristics, because I spent so long pretending to be a girl and, not wanting to be completely unrealistic. I was telling Rob about this, Rob Henderson, and we use this term authentic catfish. He'd be like, that's a good title for an article. What's an oxymoron, right? So I'd have these one-on-one dates. I did reasonably well at scheduling dates because, again, it's all texting. And then they'd meet me first 5 minutes, see how awkward I am, find an excuse to leave. And I slowly got better through trial and error. But I still didn't know how to interact with people like in class or in a real setting or at parties. I didn't even get invited to parties. It slowly got better. And, I had my first few relationships and became more outgoing. Like even something like eye contact, the way I'm looking at you now, I used to be really afraid of that. And your dad was a big help. Red pill community, in its own way, it was a big help, at least insofar as it got me on the stepping stone to reading and listening to better male role models, because red pill online, it's almost like a spin-off of the incel community, right? It's like the incels that, and I was like that, right? Involuntary celibate, graduated high school without a first kiss, overweight, and then lanky and awkward even after he loses the weight. But it slowly got better, and the red pill people, there was a lot of misogyny there. It's almost like they adopted this self-improvement mindset, but then simultaneously had this deep insecurity, like if it didn't work, then it's the girl's fault, because, and they're hyping each other up, and some of it is genuinely positive. They're saying, here's how to count calories, here's how to go to the gym, here's what you should do, look people in the eye, give them a firm handshake. Like all of that stuff really helped me. And I'm pretty sure it was from there, red pill on Reddit, that I stumbled across one of your dad's first videos. And then I was hooked. That also was a major contributor to me switching to cognitive science from physics, getting interested in psychology and brain development, and then PhD in the department he used to work at. The rest is history.
Yeah. So are you in David Buss's lab?
David Buss is at UT Austin,
Okay,
and he's
so
an
no.
evolutionary psychologist.
Whose lab are you in?
I'm in Leah Somerville's lab.
Okay.
And she specializes in adolescent brain development. But the puberty and hormones research is also fairly new to our lab. We have this NIH grant that we're working on. This is all part of Human Connectome Project, which is a massive study. There are different wings of it. So there's the main Human Connectome Project, which is brain development in adults ages 22 to 65. There's a separate cohort looking at brain aging, 65 plus. There's an infancy and toddler cohort. And then there's the development one, which we're working on, which is 1,300 kids ages 5 to 21. And you have different functional MRI measures, structural brain activation, connectivity. And then what I'm working on specifically is we have saliva, hair, and maybe blood forthcoming hormones data and puberty measures, and linking that to different brain and psychological outcomes of interest.
Wow, that's really interesting. You said yesterday you had an issue with functional MRIs in kids.
So there are some issues that people have known about for a long time. One is just that kids move in the scanner and you have to lie really still, so you can get motion artifacts that just mess up your data. But you can teach kids to stay still, and even if you have to throw out half the data, if you get enough kids, you're gonna have enough usable data. Mm-hmm. So that's more just a practical challenge, but it can be overcome. The other one is if you're averaging across dozens or hundreds of brains in a study, you can get a really precise estimate of, on average, what brain region is active during a particular task. So like I study reward sensitivity. So often you'll use a gambling game paradigm, and basically you're measuring brain activity during the whole game. And what you want to do ideally is filter out, say, wins versus losses, because if you're just looking at straight win activity, you're not getting just reward response in the brain. You're also getting what is the visual cortex doing when you're looking at the screen. You're getting how is the motor cortex preparing to press the button, because you have to press the button for the gambling game. But if you have win minus loss, then in principle, you filter out all of the stuff that's the same in the task across whatever condition, and you're isolating what is my brain doing uniquely when I win money compared to when I lose money. And there, very robustly, you'll see response in the ventral striatum, which is known to be the brain region primarily responsible for reward processing. And especially in addiction models, you'll see this. It's part of the mesolimbic mesocortical dopamine system. It's dopaminergic. Testosterone influences ventral striatal development and dopamine function. And all of that's very well established. The part that's trickier, and this is the part that's troubling for my research, if you're looking at group averages, either in what part of the brain is responsive or how does it change with age on average, you can get very good estimates of that. If you're trying to make individualized predictions, you can say, on average, does more testosterone correspond to more ventral striatum activity? And the answer is yes. But if you want to make an individualized prediction, does more circulating hormone levels in your blood correspond to more brain blood flow in this one participant, so the thing that would actually be translational, the answer is no. And not only that, but sometimes that can be backwards. So think about what the hormone levels that we're measuring. First of all, it's a single time point, so it could be confounded, especially if you're measuring it through saliva, which most psychology research does, because it's cheap and it's easy. You don't have to stick a needle in their arm, but it's really noisy. It can be influenced by the last thing you've eaten, how much you slept, what your stress levels are, a whole host of confounds. So ideally, you'd want a whole bunch of samples, maybe day to day, week to week, month to month, especially for females, because then you can also get menstrual cycle fluctuations messing with hormone levels. So you want a lot of samples to be able to confidently assess the estimate. But then even if you can do that, circulating hormone levels doesn't tell you what the individual genetic response to that is going to be. So you could have someone with twice the testosterone as me, but functionally it's as if they have less because their androgen receptors aren't as sensitive, or vice versa.
Can you test that at all or no?
Maybe. That's a question for a physician.
I haven't heard of anybody's ability to test androgen receptor sensitivity. Maybe.
We could talk more about testosterone and reward sensitivity.
Yeah. So this might be a really stupid question, but I don't know what I'm talking about here. But you said there was a relationship there. So do men get like a higher dopamine release in their reward system because of testosterone, or is that not true? Is that just wrong? You can tell me.
I'm pausing because there's a version of the answer that's yes and a version of the answer that's no. Okay, so we do know that testosterone influences the structure and function of the ventral striatum, so it's going to make it more reward sensitive. Now, does that mean that it's literally more dopamine, or does it just mean it's more sensitive? So this brings up an important distinction in endocrinology research: organizational versus activational effects of hormones. So organizational refers to these developmental effects. Anything physiological is developmental. So the physical changes that happen during puberty for either sex, those are pretty much permanent. This is why, again, for the puberty blockers debate, it's such a big deal, because if you are one of these people with innate gender dysphoria and you do want to transition, then early intervention is necessary to block development of these opposite sex traits. But there's also other questions about can children consent, and we can get back into that. But organizational effects basically are permanent. So for the body, those are more straightforward. For the brain, it has to do with, again, sensitive or critical windows of brain development. And then activational effects is how is your brain and behavior changing in response to circulating hormone levels. So take the testosterone away, the reward sensitivity goes away, the sex drive goes away. And you see those studies both in experimental animal research where rodents may be castrated or given hormone replacement, and you'll see these massive effects, or even in human clinical populations like testicular cancer patients. If they have to be castrated, then you'll see sex drive and motivation plummets, and then they go on testosterone replacement therapy and it comes back. And not only that, but they can go back on a fraction of once they had, and it's enough to reinstate sex drive. So it's not the dose-response relationship that most people think of. It's not you have 10% more testosterone, so you're going to have 10% more aggression or sex drive, in part because, again, circulating hormone levels doesn't tell you much about how it's actually bioavailable. But then beyond that, it's not a dose-response relationship. It seems to be more of this threshold effect of you have enough to turn the sexual system on, or you don't, or same thing with aggression, status competition. And if you have unnaturally high steroid levels, then you can also see increased sex drive or aggression, but a little bit more testosterone isn't going to correspond necessarily to a little bit more of those behaviors.
That's interesting. So for women and their reward system, do you think the amount of testosterone they have is enough to turn that on? Is that how it works, or is it just different in women?
So here's what I think is an open question. We know for sure that males are more reward sensitive and more prone to risk taking, especially during adolescence.
So wait, can we pause? So what exactly is reward sensitive?
Reward sensitive, it could be actual response in the brain, how much ventral striatum activity and how much dopamine release you see. It could also be in one of these gambling game studies, like how willing are you to take a risk for potential reward? Or if you're talking about sex drive reward, there have been interesting studies where you'll show participants porn in the scanner and you can measure physiological arousal. You can measure skin conductance. In men, you can even measure the pressure of their downstairs arousal. And those are a bunch of individual differences that may or may not correlate with testosterone levels, but at the very least, if you completely eliminated it, like with androgen blockers, then that would go away. So there's some baseline level. And what I'm not sure of, the open question here, is the female level the baseline? And then what you do is you say males have more of this, therefore they're more likely to take risks. But you also see that beginning at puberty, women are more anxious and more depressed, or at least have a propensity for it. We don't know, is this because testosterone inhibits anxiety? And there's some animal research to suggest that, and even anecdotal experience for people who take testosterone replacement therapy. But it also could be that ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone, increase anxiety and depression. And there are all sorts of evolutionary theories for this. So it makes sense for males to be more reward sensitive and more willing to take risks because one man can, in principle, impregnate dozens of women. So if he can take some major risk for acquiring status, or if he's more aggressive, as long as he can fertilize those eggs, even if he gets himself killed shortly after, even if 90% of people who try get themselves killed, it can be a stable reproductive strategy for men. And then it makes sense why women would try to be more cautious, especially because women take care of children cross-culturally and have to be more threat sensitive and protective of these vulnerable infants. You also see interesting interactions with oxytocin here. They call it the mama bear effect. So oxytocin, it's known as the love hormone, the cuddle hormone, but it can increase aggression. And what it really does is it increases the strength of an overall in-group or out-group response. So if it increases care towards the in-group, but it also, through a chemical cousin of it called vasopressin, increases aggression towards the out-group, this mama bear aggression.
That's so interesting. I'm going to step away from that a little bit. I want to talk about how has university been like for you in the political landscape that we're in now? I know what it was like for me in 2012, and it was troublesome for me then. But you're at Harvard. So what's it like there politically? Is it as crazy as it looks in the news?
Definitely not as crazy as in the news, but you do see some of those issues. So here's the interesting thing. I think institutionally, there's really not as much of a problem with free speech. Like you do see some examples of professors getting canceled, but even if they're canceled, what it often looks like is you're disinvited to speak at a conference or something like that. And that's terrible. That shouldn't happen. Like you should encourage disagreement and debate, but very rarely are people losing their jobs. At least at Harvard, it does happen at places. You know, even Carol Hooven's story, which is the most extreme example that I know of at Harvard, she wasn't officially fired for going on Fox News and talking about the binary reality of sex and talking about her book on testosterone. But socially, people just made her life there such hell that she was essentially forced to leave. So that's what you see more of. It's almost like bullying or passive aggressive. It's like this sense of false common knowledge, like in the Emperor's New Clothes story, this idea that everyone is thinking that this thing you can't say, even if most people themselves are thinking it. And for whatever reason, maybe I'm more disagreeable. Maybe it's because I had a more atypical social upbringing, so I'm not as attuned or as willing to follow those sorts of social norms. Generally, I always speak my mind. And I've doubled down on this really ever since I started listening to your dad and exploring my faith more and believing in this foundational logos. So now I think whatever the price is for saying what I believe to be true, I'd much rather pay that price than speak falsehood or hold my tongue. So that has worked. And it's it's very polarizing. I'll say that. It's made the people who admire and respect me, I think, admire me and grow close to me in that way a lot. And it's led to opportunities like this, like being on your podcast. But it's also made a bunch of other people think, okay, that's the controversial guy that's interested in evolutionary psychology and hormones and sex differences, and he's into Jordan Peterson, and just stay away. He's this bad conservative guy. And I'm also a diversity fellow at Harvard. So this is on the DEI committee, which I applied for this role because I had this sense that those committees, despite diversity being in the name, were not very diverse. So I actually wrote my application basically saying this, like, I have more conservative, unorthodox views. I actually called myself conservative Christian, and I was raised around Christianity. My take is more abstract. We spoke about this a little bit. So I think it's very far from what that term probably rings a bell as, like, MAGA evangelical Republican. And I'm quite far from that. But my stance to DEI is, even if I was that, like, there's no reason that shouldn't be welcome. Like, that's genuine diversity.
That was your essay?
Not in those terms. Like, I didn't say, even if I was a MAGA Republican, I should be able to serve on this committee. But, that's the spirit that inspired me to apply. And the interesting thing, I have mixed feelings about this, because on one hand, I'm able to express my opinion, and I'm never going to get in trouble for it, because it is expressing diversity. I'm not making personal attacks. I'm literally just saying, here's my opinion. If you disagree, I welcome that. Like, tell me why you disagree. Like, let's debate. I find that stuff fun. I think some people find it intimidating, or they worry, are there going to be social or career consequences to this? And I think there are. Like, I'm playing a bit of a gamble here. I think it's going to work out for me. Like, I have faith that it'll work out for me. But I don't know how it's going to be received.
Crazy. Okay. This reminded me. I thought this was interesting because, like, I feel like most of my audience is older than university, so they don't know what's going on now. How has AI impacted people in university? Are they using it? Are professors allowing it? Can they test for it?
I think it's left up to each professor. I don't think the university has an official stance on it. So some professors say it's completely banned, but then I guess that means they do have to test for it somehow. I don't know how the tests go for it, but I don't think most students are using it, at least not like it's going to write your essay for you, because it's really bad.
Yeah, they're really bad.
It'll make up citations. It'll just say things that are completely wrong. I found that it can be good for summarizing papers, but even if you do that, it's like, it depends what you want. If you want literally a 1-paragraph high-level summary and you don't need any nuance, then it's perfect for that. As soon as you need nuance, which you need a lot of in grad school and in research, then it's useless.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So let's get back into faith, because you told me yesterday you've done an insane amount of research on religions around the world and different philosophers. So, like, where are you? What do you believe right now?
So insane amount of research to me signifies like I'm doing a PhD in it, and my gut instinct is this is just like a side personal interest, so I couldn't tell you much about the history of it. But personally, it stems from, I think, part growing up exposed to Christianity, but then thinking there was no substance to it, like learning about evolution and not having people I could go to and have critical discussions about it, like people who say, take it literally or leave it. So I decided to leave it. And it turned into actually this anti-theistic phase in my teenage years. But in retrospect, I look at that like I was already depressed, I was overweight and resentful, and spending all my time online with this bunch of sickos. And, it's not surprising to me that I had such a pessimistic attitude towards faith. It's like the Cain mindset, Cain and Abel. That resonated a lot. Your dad's Bible series resonated a lot with me in college. And it was for two reasons. The first was because he took a very secular approach to it. Like he's integrating it with evolutionary psychology rather than putting it at odds with it. And then secondly, like, he really talks about the depths of those negative experiences, like this resentful envy that one can experience. And I experienced this going to USC. You know, on one hand, I went on scholarship. So I applied through QuestBridge, this scholarship for low-income students. Coming from a single mom, I wrote my essay about that. I wrote about how growing up in poverty with a single mom, and I spent most of my time online, that I had to do things like learn how to shave, learn how to tie a tie from YouTube tutorials, and that it taught me this level of independence. It gave me research skills and how I want to translate that into actual academic research. So that worked out for me. But then, you know, it's like a rich party school. The make fun of it nickname for it is University of Spoiled Children. And there were a lot of those. So I didn't fit in. Part of that was because of my own social difficulties. But I would oscillate between this resentful victim attitude, like, look at all these people who are coming from wealthy 2-parent households. I don't fit in here. They went to private school. They're so much more articulate than me. I don't know what I'm doing. And then simultaneously thinking, like, I'm going to one of the best colleges for free, and other people across the world like are starving or can't get an education whatsoever. Like, what right do I have to be a victim? And I would go spiral in those states. And I think it was just this inherent interest in science and philosophy. I couldn't tell you why I had that. So that's a cool thing too. It's almost like it was a protective factor for me, because I could have been out causing a bunch of trouble. I did that online a little bit, like the scamming people on video games. Luring was this thing you'd do in RuneScape. So like there'd be PvP areas where players could fight each other. And if you were a young kid like I was when I first started playing, people could trick you into coming there. They'd kill you and take their stuff. So then rather than learning not to do that, I learned to do it to other kids. And then I would even justify it as in like, well, if you're that naive, you deserve to have your stuff taken. And that's probably the same attitude that whatever older kid killed me in my first couple years playing the game did. So it's like I was morally grasping for something, right? And trying to justify my own existence, and maybe being more anxious and guilt prone. It wasn't just, I'm going to get here and exploit as much as possible and then try to get a job and make the most money as possible. I think part of that was engaging with these philosophical ideas pretty early on. And it was through game theory that I started to really wrestle with objective morality. It was through that, as well as this famous Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And the basic idea there is that Gödel, famous mathematician, proved that any mathematical system, you can make it logically coherent with a given set of axioms, and you can prove anything within that structure, but you have to accept axioms. So that's almost like a leap of faith, right? And I started reflecting more. It was really after listening to the Bible series that even though I called myself such a secular, rational empiricist, like, where did my idea that truth is good come from? Where did my idea even that the universe has an organized structure come from? Like, I realized that I had, at the very least, a metaphysics of physics. Like, I believed there was this set of natural equations that could explain the world, and I just took it as a given that that was there. That's kind of a faith-based belief. It's obviously evidence-based. Like, you can prove that these laws are out there. But then I started to ask, is the same thing true for morality? And I think the conclusion that many of these secular thinkers come to is no. Like, you can make an evolutionary argument for it, why cooperation is sometimes adaptive, but then you'll come up with all these different exceptions and cultural relativism to it. But it was listening to this Bible series, and particularly the Jungian psychology that was in it, and connecting that to this idea of archetypes. There was a line that your dad had about how Dawkins' mimetic evolution, that memes undergo natural selection, so like a joke can be modified to be made funnier and spread more, or it can just die, that an archetype is something like the most extreme asymptotic destination that a meme converges towards. So then there was this thought of there's that. And then in game theory, there are these equilibria, these optimal solutions that you can reach. And some of them are cooperative. And there was just this stitching together with that. I also read Maps of Meaning at this time. And
what did you think of that? Did you understand it?
It took me a while. I was listening to the class lectures alongside that. It's like dense 500 pages, but this was while I was taking the neuroscience. So I was familiar with a lot of the references and I was getting really into the philosophy. So it literally changed my life, hands down. So that's why it's so cool to be doing this.
Oh, that's cool. That's very cool.
I started definitely taking a more metaphysical orientation, but trying to string it together. Like, okay, so morality is definitely reflective of our evolutionary psychology, but it's not that it's just subjective and arbitrary. There's going to be some almost mathematical laws that guide us in a particular direction, and that's going to be whatever this optimal solution is if you're framing it in a game theory economic way, like trying to maximize cooperation or resources. But then there's also the narrative organizing part that's talked about in Maps of Meaning. So this idea that information itself, like memes, can be operated on in terms of natural selection, and that those could co-evolve with humanity so that our moral intuition can really co-evolve with these evolving morals that are transmitted in stories, and then thinking, okay, there are universal patterns in different world mythologies and world religions, and those are reflective of our evolutionary psychology in some deep way. So you can still make the case, okay, it's arbitrary, it's a reflection of the human psyche, but at the very least, it's not arbitrary. It's like deep in our nature, and then it's, I think, our responsibility to figure out what those stories are telling us.
That was great. I feel like that made more sense to me than Dad explaining Maps of Meaning. Just so you know. That was good.
That's a really high compliment.
Yeah, no, that was really good. Wow. Okay. So do puberty blockers, if you give them to people when they're like 3 and they take them throughout puberty, can they ever recover from that? Like, can you go back to a normal brain structure after that? Do they have research on that?
Okay, so puberty blockers were FDA approved in the United States in 1993, and they were approved for precocious puberty, which is a medical diagnosis where you're beginning puberty way too early, like below age 8 or even below age 7. And they're called GnRH agonists, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So this is a hormone that's produced in the hypothalamus that signals to the pituitary gland to release other hormones that signal to the gonads, testes in males to begin producing testosterone, or ovaries to produce estrogen in females. And what they do, at first I thought that it was going to be an antagonist, a blocker, right? But the cool thing, the way the hypothalamus releases GnRH, it works in a pulsatile fashion, so it goes up and down, and your brain is expecting a certain rhythm. And the agonist, it just floods it. It's like constant activation. We actually don't know whether is it that it becomes desensitized, so then your brain just no longer responds, or is it just the fact that it's constant activation, so it's not following the rhythmic pattern, so then it doesn't work because your brain only responds to that rhythm. We don't know, but either way, it's an agonist that essentially shuts off the remaining cascade. And it specifically inhibits gonadal pubertal development. So there's adrenal-driven pubertal development. So this would be like the sex non-specific secondary sex characteristics like body hair, acne, body odor. That stuff still happens if you're given puberty blockers. So that's perfect for someone with precocious puberty. So you're going to still go through the early pre-pubertal development, but you're not going to be growing secondary sex characteristics so early, like at age 6 or 7. So the drugs work very well for that. And then the theory for youth with gender dysphoria was going to be, well, you're already experiencing gender dysphoria as a result of your birth-assigned sex, and magnifying those characteristics is only going to make it worse. So the theory here is we block that, and it'll at the very least give you more time to think, so they say, and decide whether you want to pursue puberty, whether the gender dysphoria resolves or not, or whether you want to transition. And over 90% of kids who are prescribed puberty blockers, so if they're prescribed, it's off-label. It's not illegal, but it was originally meant and approved for precocious puberty. And it was more theoretical, proposed that, well, it's very intuitive, right? Like if you experience gender dysphoria, you want to be the opposite sex, these hormones are the things that give you the opposite sex traits, then very well it might reduce your symptoms. But also, you could imagine a comparison to anorexia. Like if you're experiencing extreme body dysmorphia and you think you're overweight, then maybe weight loss pills would make your symptoms go down. But with anorexia, it generally just spirals and it can become life-threatening. So for me, that's a really open question, and I think people need to be talking about it more. I'm not opposed to the idea that gender dysphoria would resolve. And I think that if it's, say, the innate case, like what you see with 5-alpha reductase, where it could go either way, beginning at puberty, you start to experience these masculinizing features, and maybe you decide you want to live your life as a man, even though you didn't know you were one, or maybe you decide you want to block them and continue as a woman. I think for those types of people, it's probably the right decision. But you also see in recent years, the rate of gender dysphoria cases has skyrocketed, like more than 10 times the amount of previous decades. And also the sex ratio has swapped. So historically, it's been more males who transition to be women. And now with Gen Z girls, it's mostly females identifying as either non-binary or trans men. And they're taking puberty blockers. So again, puberty blockers, if they are harmless when it comes to physiological and reproductive development, with one exception. The one exception is bone density. And that's because sex steroids fuse the growth plates. So the adrenal processes that facilitate height, growth spurt, those are separate hormones. If you block GnRH, that pathway still continues. So this, you can see in people who were castrated, in eunuchs, there are historical records going back centuries that they often grow to be really tall and lanky because, again, they have excess growth hormone and there's no gonadal hormones that fuse the growth plate and inhibit that growth hormone signaling.
Oh, wow. I had no idea about that.
Right. So bone density can be compromised, but as long as you have the sex steroids later, that will resolve. And reproductive function, again, as long as you go through puberty, your birth sex puberty, I don't think there will be any long-term harms to reproduction. But two problems there. The first is most of them do go on cross-sex hormones, and those are more likely to impair fertility. And then second, well, the only thing we know is that adolescence is a sensitive period for brain development that's expectant of certain hormonal inputs, and that the hormones are involved in these high-level cognitive processes like reward sensitivity, like social cognition, like emotion regulation, and that they're somehow related to these massive sex differences that we see that have health implications, like risk-taking in males or anxiety and depression in females. At the very least, we know that they're going to be influenced, and it could be for the better, but just this theory that you're making unpredictable changes, and we don't even understand on the individual differences level how it's going to impact anxiety or depression. And we do know from limited animal studies that at the very least, it impacts cortical development structurally. We don't know exactly what the function would be. There's limited evidence that's been contested that it might increase anxiety-like behaviors or depressive-like behaviors, which would be really ironic and unfortunate because the whole point of it is to decrease these internalizing symptoms.
Yeah. Okay.
So there was just this massive review, the Cass review
by
Dr. Hilary Cass. It was funded by England's NHS, their NIH equivalent. And really, it just said that we don't have any high quality longitudinal evidence. We can't make any claims whether these things are good or bad. The theory, again, is intuitive. Maybe gender dysphoria will resolve, but there's all these open questions about why are so many kids, so many more kids than before, coming out as trans. It could be because we're more accepting, there's less stigma. I think that could explain a small part of it, but probably not this massive spike that seems limited just to Gen Z, and it doesn't explain the sex ratio swap. So that's talked about in the review. And then the review gestures at their unknown effects on brain development, and no one's studying that in humans. No, that's not true. There are a few clinical trials that are being done. We still don't have the data. And what you really want is longitudinal evidence. There are also some animal studies. But the open question and the recommendation from the CAS review is we shouldn't call this treatment before we know if the benefits outweigh the harms, even though there might be potential benefits, especially for these types of intersex conditions where due to genetic abnormalities or due to hormonal imbalances, you might stand very well to benefit from it. But given the unknowns, especially for brain development in typically developing children, this shouldn't be prescribed outside of clinical trials. It's a separate question, like an ethical question, whether to even do the clinical trials, whether children can consent to them. I don't know if we have time for all that. And plus, that's more subjective, so I'll leave it at that. That's where the evidence stands.
Okay, that's like the nerdiest way of saying this was a bad idea that I've ever heard. But okay, so then delving into that a little bit, doesn't it seem reasonable because there are so many more girls that are interested or going towards or gender dysphoric, or that it's kind of 2024's version of hysteria? Like, aren't women more impacted by these kind of social disorders? Like, I know anorexia, if you're friends with a bunch of people that have anorexia, then you're more likely to get that, right?
There's really good social network analysis on this. So yeah, anorexia, body image disorders, cutting, suicidality, smoking in both sexes, but those former cases, especially in girls, you definitely see peer influence. Hysteria, I know that there were those historical cases. I don't know enough about those, but the natural parallel to me. So the other thing I'll say, this is such a polarized topic, but I have a pretty optimistic take on it. The optimism is that you can tell that everyone wants the well-being of the children, top priority, right? You just have very different ideas of what that looks like. For some people, they think the hormones are life-saving and it's what the children need. For other people, that hormones might destroy the child's life. They can't consent. They want to protect the children. So the good news is everyone wants to protect the children, right? Like, we really care about this, and it's really important research, and we need high quality longitudinal evidence. So that's being done. That's a good thing. I also think there's this lingering collective conscience about how we used to treat the same LGBT populations. So homosexuality used to be in the DSM as a mental disorder. Not only that, they used to give hormonal treatments for it. It was really chemical castration. You know the story of Alan Turing?
Let's go through it.
Father of modern computer science. He helped crack the Germans' cryptography code during World War II, helped win or end it early, and built the first modern computer in order to do that. He was also gay, and he was closeted this whole time. While in the UK, it was a criminal offense, and he had all these top secret security clearances. Once it was outed that he was having these secret affairs with men, rather than put him in jail, he was given this option to go on chemical castration, and it made him severely depressed. I don't know what he was given exactly. It may have been testosterone blockers. It probably wasn't just that. So it eliminates sex drive, but it also eliminates motivation. It seems that it made him severely depressed, and he killed himself. So we lost a great mind because of that. And conversion therapy was a disaster. So the fundamental question for transgender identity is it more similar to sexual orientation, born this way, or is it more similar to anorexia, social contagion? I think the answer is both for different people. That's why I really wanted to talk about this famous twin study and the intersex conditions, because I do believe firmly that there's an innate biological cause, at least in some people, probably in earlier cohorts, in most of them, that gives them gender dysphoria, that makes them really risk their life to go through this transition back when the stigma was way, way higher. It's still a problem, but the fact that people used to do it decades ago and that it used to be mostly males who experienced that, that's an interesting research question to me. And I think something about the increase rates combined with the sex ratio swap that makes me think it's more likely that in probably the majority of Gen Z trans men, females identifying as men, that is probably not the same biological innate cause. It's probably manifesting late onset during puberty. So there's this term, late onset or rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this is the social contagion hypothesis. It's gotten a whole lot of flack. And to be clear, there's no data to support it. I think it's a very interesting hypothesis. And I don't think if it's true, that it's true for everyone. That's this binary thinking that I think is the root of this problem. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution.
Interesting. I'm probably in the more of the camp that maybe 1% of the people you see now that are experiencing gender dysphoria are actually have a biological root and a real problem. I feel like the rest of it might be a social contagion.
Right.
But like I have no data for that. That's just what it looks like.
Yeah.
I think.
So it's
We'll
all
see.
a real problem, and it's all going to have serious psychological side effects that everyone wants to treat, whether that's through therapy, whether it's watchful waiting and its children are going to grow out of it. Maybe they're going to turn out to be gay and otherwise completely healthy cisgender. I think that's probably the case for some. Again, for some, they might benefit from puberty blockers or hormone replacement. But again, we have no evidence that that actually reduces negative mental health side effects. And there's theoretical reason that maybe it would actually exacerbate them. But again, we don't have solid evidence of that either.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Well, I'm officially mind blown. That was great.
Thank you, Mikhaila.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on.